Hey guys, this is Mitch with FinePoint CGI, and today we're going to go ahead and talk about particles, more specifically 3D particles. We'll cover 2D particles when I do my 2D section of the Godot basics, but today we're going to be going through particles. So we're going to talk about how to create particles, and we're going to talk about all the different settings and things like that that you can do to it to make your particle system actually look really cool. And then we're going to create a fire particle system, like a little fire simulation. So that's what I have in store for you guys. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so I'm sitting here in Godot, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a 3D scene because we're going to be talking about 3D particles. So what we'll do is we'll click on 3D scene. We're going to go ahead and right click on the spatial node, and we will right click and add a child node. Now we're going to type in PART to do particles, and you will see that we have two different types here. So you have the CPU particles and the GPU particles. Now it really just depends on what you want it to be bound to, right? Do you want it to be bound to CPU cycles or GPU cycles? And it just depends on what you want. Generally speaking, you're going to want to use GPU particles, so we'll go ahead and use that this time. So what we're going to do is we're going to double click that, and you will see here that we got this cool little tool here, okay? And what we're going to do is, you can move it around, and you can rotate it and scale it and move the actual particle system as well. So you could actually move it like over here if you wanted to. That's where the emission area is. And this is where like the location of the actual particle system is. So you could have a particle system sitting in one spot and emitting in another. But we're going to put it back to exactly where it was. And what we're going to do is you're going to come over here to the inspector, and we'll run through some of these things. So you have emitting on or off. So this is useful, so you can turn on and off the particle system. Amount, which is the amount of particles. I believe it's per second, I believe. And then if you go to time, you can see what the lifetime is. So in this case, they are for 1 second. One shot, so if it's only going to run once. Pre-process, basically, if it's going to pre-process the particles before the animation starts, so before anything takes effect. Speed scale, how fast things work. Explosiveness, if they're going to explode, so that way, basically, well, I shouldn't say that. The way that it works is it, as it says here, it's the time ratio between all the particles being emitted. So if you set it to 1, all the particles are emitted at once, and if you set it to 0, all of the particles are emitted over time. Randomness is the randomness of the explosiveness. Fixed FPS is a fixed FPS. So we'll get to some of these. I'll run back through them when we get our drawing going and stuff like that, but we'll get there. So let's click on drawing, and you'll see that you have these different coordinates and things like that. So where things are being drawn and the actual draw order. So you have index, lifetime, and view depth. So index goes by the index of the particle. Lifetime goes by the lifetime of the particle. And view depth goes by the view depth. So how close they are to the camera. Now, again, most of these you're not going to need to change, but it's just options for you to be able to change. So let's go down here to process material. Now, what is a process material? Well, a process material is your particle system itself. Godot kind of allows you to, in theory, use multiple different types of particle systems. So like later they could build a different type of particle system. And it's kind of like a material almost. So what you could do is you can click here and you could do a shader material or a particles material. And what we're going to do today is a particle material. So if you go ahead and click on that, what you're going to see is if I click this, if I click on it, you will see it opens. You'll see I have render priority of 0 and next pass. Next pass is what happens after it renders the particle. What does it do after that? So you could, in theory, have a particle that renders after another particle has rendered. So you could have it so that it, think of it kind of like for rain, right? The rain drops, the little splashes of water. That's kind of what that would be for. So what we're going to do first is we are going to go ahead and come down to draw passes, which draw passes, if I bring this up, Draw passes is the geometry it's going to be drawing every single frame. So let's go to pass 1 and I can kind of show you some of these things. So array mesh is an array of meshes. So you could actually give it an array of meshes to render. You could give it capsule meshes, and you can see it now throwing capsule meshes. You can now see it throwing capsule meshes out like this, and we could do things like changing the radius to make it bigger, or the height to make it bigger or longer, things like that. You could do the different quality, and with particle systems, you kind of want to lower your quality down, something like this, so that way you're just not killing your system. Just as a side note, but we don't really need to worry about this as much. And you can also do stuff like you could do other stuff like plane meshes, dropping planes. But in this case, we're going to do a quad mesh. And what a quad mesh is it's just this up and down quad here that's just being dropped. So what we'll do is we'll come up here to our process material, and I'm going to run through all of these for you. So again, next pass, if I were to do a particle material and I were to come in here, I could actually emit a sub-particle material. Now, we don't want to do that necessarily. Well, we don't want to do that this time at least, but it is a cool option that you guys can have. So let's go ahead and clear that. Time is lifetime random. So if I bring this up, you'll notice that, see how some of them are disappearing and some of them are living longer. So if we bring that back down, you'll see that it all becomes kind of uniform. But if we bring this up, you'll see that it's not as uniform. Trail, we'll add in a trail. So let me clear that. Oops. So trail, we'll go ahead and add in a trail. You can actually add in like a gradient texture, and it kind of creates like a smoky trail to it. Emission shape will create a shape. So if I were to do like a sphere, you'll see that the objects are emitting in a sphere. So if I actually bring that sphere up, you can see kind of like how you would do rain almost. That's basically what this is for. So going with that, I guess, rain feeling, right? Let's look at some of the other things. So you have flags align Y, which aligns it on the Y axis. You can see it kind of funks this one up. Rotate Y, which will tell it to rotate on the Y axis, and disable Z, which disables the Z buffer. So if you were to rotate this, you can see that it's all emitting flat, versus with Z on, you can see that it doesn't emit flat. So that's a cool feature there. Direction is the direction of the emission, if I remember correctly. Gravity is so that you could determine the gravity of your stuff. So in this case, if we want to make something like fire, let's like go with 2. You can see how it kind of floats up, right? So if we were to make that, I don't know, 3, a little bit more aggressive. Actually, let's just go with 7, right? So you can see how it kind of is flying up like that. So if you're making something like a portal or something like that, this would be a good way of doing that. If we change our initial velocity up, you'll see that it's just getting shot out everywhere, and then we can control that with our direction. So if I change this to like, now if I reduce this to the opposite direction, you'll see that it flies out in weird directions. Same thing with spread and flatness. It basically affects how that velocity gets handled. So you can see if I set the direction to 0, how they're all flying this direction. So that's just something to keep in mind. So if I were to set this to 1, see how they're all flying in this direction. Okay. So We're not going to really use velocity, so we'll just keep it like that. And you have velocity random as well. So if I turn on velocity again to kind of show you guys the random, if I add in random, you'll see that there's random velocity going on to this. See that? Going on with this. How some go up and some go sideways because of the gravity that we set up. Let's go ahead and set velocity to 0. We have angular velocity, which is an angle velocity. So if I turn that up, does nothing apparently. Oh, it's for rotation. So angular velocity is for rotation, and I'll show you guys that in a little bit when we get into materials, because it's a little funky. I believe there's an issue with Godot. Oh, okay. So angular velocity, you need to disable your Z, and then you can turn on angular velocity, and you'll see that they are rotating. So we're getting closer to what we're trying to do. And we'll up that velocity random to be very random. So you can see how some of them are super rotated, some of them are not. And then you have the orbit velocity. And if you turn that up, it's almost like it's freaking out. So let me actually bring that down. Holy criminy. So let's bring it down to like a 1. So you can see how you could create some kind of like portal effect, or like maybe feathers or papers flying in the wind or something like that, swirling around something. Velocity random makes it so that some of them are random. Some of them have lots of velocity, some have no velocity. And a velocity curve is used to curve this. And I should have said this earlier, but you have like initial velocity curve, orbit velocity curve, and I mean all of the other velocity curves. But basically, you can come in here and be like, oh, you know, later in my time frame, let's do 1 and 0 here. Let's bring this down. So you can see if I were to bring this down to something small, how you can actually make it so that it has more velocity up at the center and almost no velocity down at the bottom. And that's some cool little features that you can do to kind of create a cool little particle effect. So I really suggest that you mess with these curves. Flags is used for like MIP maps and repeating and anisotropic tracing and stuff like that. You're probably not going to use this, at least for a while, so don't worry about it. And resources is just additional resources. Linear acceleration is about linear acceleration, so you can see how they now accelerate really fast. So if I were to turn this into 1, you can see it's slowly accelerating faster. Acceleration random will randomize the amount of acceleration. And acceleration curve gives you a curve of that acceleration based off of time. So what we can do is we could set this down like this. Set this to 1 and 1. Or 0 and 1. Let's bring this down. Bring this down. And you can see how it's slowly gaining speed. And it kind of levels out and gains speed as it goes up, which is kind of what we want. So I would go ahead and add that. Bake resolution is the number of points that it can bake of curve data when you're doing your final project. So that way it's not spending time calculating these points on the fly. It can just say, I need to do this math to make my particle system work better. Radial acceleration is used to accelerate it away from the center. So you could use this like explosions or things like that. Same thing with acceleration random. And acceleration curve does the same thing as the other acceleration curves. Tangential acceleration spins them around and kind of throws them into a random direction, kind of like a hook or a curve. So you can see it kind of curves it. And acceleration random is the same thing, randomizes that acceleration curve. And acceleration curve just gives you a curve. Same stuff. dampening allows you to dampen particles. So you can see how now they're being dampened by this dampening thing, so they're slowing down. Now, the nice thing about it and the reason why you like it is because of dampening random. So you can dampen some of them a lot. So if I were to bring this down to something like this, you can see how some of them are being dampened so that they can't really move. So if we kill dampening, angle allows you to change the spawned in angle of these particles. So you can see how it's rotating them all. And then if you do a random, now they're all spawning in at random angles versus all spawning in at the same angle. Scale allows you to adjust the scale of your particle system. So if you want small particles or large particles, you can adjust them right here. And if you do scale random of 1, you'll notice that some particles are big and some particles are small. And a scale curve does the same thing. So if I were to add in a scale curve, and I were to bring this down, you'll notice that they're small and then they grow to be bigger. Now we're going to do it the exact opposite. We're going to say they start off small and they grow, or start off big and grow to be small. Like that. Color is the color of the particles. I believe if you're not using a mesh instance, you can determine the color of your particles. In this case, we're using a mesh instance and a color ramp if you'd like to use color ramp. Hue variation is the same thing. And animation allows you to play an animation based off of these particles. Whew, are you guys overwhelmed yet? Because I know I am. So now that we've got our particle system looking kind of like this, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to adjust our sphere radius and bring it down quite a lot. We want it to be something like this-ish. And then we want to go ahead and increase the amount of particles to something like that. And you can see how already it feels kind of like fire. And then what we can do is we can go ahead and increase our lifetime if we want to. Or honestly, I think I'll just stick with 1. Maybe 1.2. And then what we'll do, and you can see here, if I do speed scale, you'll see how it's being much faster than what it was. So it actually is the scale of the simulation. If we do pre-process, you'll see that it pre-processes those scale downs and all of that because it's pre-processing frames. Explosiveness, see how they all spawn in at once and then disappear? I don't need that. And randomness to that explosiveness, I believe. And fixed FPS, if I bring it down to something like 5, you see how it it slows it down to that FPS. Now this is really useful. I know it doesn't seem like it would be useful, but it's really useful. If you're doing something where, you know, you have large number of particle systems, you could set it to something like 20. And you can see how it kind of feels choppy. But if it's for something like a sconce or something that's off in the distance or something that the user's not really going to see, it's a great way to batch to handle your FPS. So if you, for instance, if I'm this far away, right? And I want to have decent performance and I have a bunch of stuff rendering, lowering my fixed frames to something low like 7 might be a good choice. Now in this case, I'm going to set it to 0, so it just takes as many frames as it would like. And we're going to scroll down here. Now that we've got this looking kind of like this, what we're going to do is we will come down to our draw pass. We will click on our quad mesh, and we're going to come down here. We don't want to touch our scale, but we do want to touch our material. So let's go ahead and click on that and do a new spatial material. Now if we click on that, you'll see I created a little material here. We're going to open that up. Now let's go ahead and make that red. And you can see now we've got a nice little red particle system. It's not quite fire, but it's pretty close. But what we are going to do is you come into these parameters here, and you can tell it to be billboard. And we want it to be a particle billboard. So you'll see that now they are always facing me. See that? Which is perfect. That's exactly what we want. And we want to turn on our keep scale. So the shader will always keep scale for the mesh. So that way when it does its billboarding, it doesn't lose its scale. I don't know if that's necessary, but it's just something that I like to have on. Now, we need to make this look like fire. So let's go ahead and open up Firefox or Chrome. And let's go to Google. And what we're going to do is we're going to type in textures.com. And we are going to go to textures.com. And I spelled textures wrong, which means I'm going to get murdered for that. But if you come down to FX and you pick an FX that you think is cool, like in this case, fire and flames, you can see that they have a bunch of photos here. Now, textures.com, I absolutely suggest you get an account. They're really great at having textures for your use. So you can go here and you can pick whatever fires you want. Now, I have already decided on the textures that I want. So I'm going to be using these two, which are textures that are based off of some smoky textures. So if you come over here to the smoke section, actually I believe it's an ink section, my apologies, there's their ink, and then I went to the smoky ink section and I picked a couple textures here, and then I went ahead and I modified them to do to do what I'm looking for, right? So I went through, and I can actually show you with my Photopea. If I click here, I did some modifications to these textures, and basically what I did was I used these little textures as like a mask, and I put fire effects inside of it to kind of give it that fiery look. So that's something that you guys can do. And if you guys don't want to do this, that's fine. I'm going to put these textures in the description below so that you can go ahead and use them for your own use. So here's what they look like. I can actually show you. They're just couple of fire alphaed out textures, nothing too crazy. So what we're gonna do is we'll take these and we'll go into Godot, we'll copy them in and drop them in. And you can see it looks like I actually already copied them in, but I'll go ahead and delete this. So you see I have these two textures here. So what we'll do is we'll come to this draw passes section. We're going to right click and add a new spatial material. We will double click on our material and we will go to our albedo texture. And what we're going to do is we will drag in our ink smoky to the texture, and you'll see suddenly it doesn't really look like fire, and it looks kind of funky, right? Like all that clipping and all that problems there. So first, let's solve the clipping issue. So if we go to parameters and we change our billboard mode, which billboard forces the image to look at the camera. So it looks at the player at all times. So it's useful for things like fire, smoke, grass, things like that, things that you want to kind of exist in the world, but you don't want it to necessarily take up a lot of polygons. So if we do a particle billboard, you'll see how it suddenly fixes that clipping, and you see how everything's now facing us. So beforehand, it wasn't really facing at us. So if I did this, you can see how it doesn't face us. But if I turn on particle billboard, it does face us. So now what we can do is we can go ahead and click on flags, transparent, to make it transparent. Now you'll also notice that there's a slight shimmer on the side over here. It's really slight, so you might not notice it right away, but it's right, there's a slight shimmer here. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna add unshaded, which will pull out that shimmer, and it'll also brighten up our colors. And now it doesn't really look like fire because there's no intensity to that flame. So what we'll do is we will change our blend mode to add. And there we go. Now that's looking way better. All right, so from here, we can go ahead and really play with our material and give it all sorts of different things, like details and refractions and things like that if we really wanted to. But I'll leave you guys to kind of go mess around with all of that. Well, what we can do now is, this looks great, but it's all very uniform, right? It's all the same. So what we can do is, if we go back and we introduce a new draw pass here, what'll happen is it'll introduce a whole nother object. So if I close this object, it'll introduce a whole nother object here that we can actually instantiate. So what we can do is, if we click on our pass and then we do new quad mesh, you'll see suddenly we have an additional quad mesh that's showing up. So what we can do is we can go to material, spatial material. We'll double click on this again. We'll go to albedo and we will drag in our second texture. And then we will do the exact same thing that we did before. Transparent, unshaded, and we will turn on our billboard. And we will turn on our blend mode as add. And now you can see it. Now it's all getting broken up. And because we added a second piece to the puzzle to help kind of break it up and make it feel better, if that makes sense. Now, the draw passes happen in sequence. So you'll see this gets drawn and then this gets drawn. And it doesn't, for each particle, by the way, it's not on each, it's not like it draws one and then does another particle and draws the other. It actually draws both of them at the same time. But it helps with breaking up that shape, if that makes sense. So now we have our fire basically done. But now let's go ahead and add smoke, because where there's smoke, there's fire, right? So if we go ahead and add a child node and we go particles. Now I'm going to run through this pretty quick, but we'll do a draw pass, one draw pass. We will make it a quad mesh, and we will go ahead and add a material. Well, let's not add a material just yet. We'll go ahead and do a process material, a new particle material. We'll drag this up to somewhere probably about, I don't know, here-ish. And then what we're going to do is we will go open up our particle mesh. We will change our gravity to something like 3, not 33, 3. And what we'll do is we will tell it to emit from a sphere. And we will adjust our sphere radius down to something like this. And then what we're going to do is we will turn our Z pass off. We will add some angular velocity here to kind of give it a little bit of rotation here. We will up our random, and we will give it some radial acceleration, just a tiny bit, because you can see radial acceleration does this. And what we're going to do is just give it a tiny bit of radial acceleration, and we'll give it quite a bit of randomness there. And we might want to increase it just a tiny bit. There we go. And then what we'll do is we will also adjust our scale random like that. And we will also adjust our angle random as well. So now it can come in at different angles. And I believe that's going to be all we'll want to do. Let's make it just a little bit more velocity here. And then what we're going to do is we will come down to our pass. We'll go to our material, and we will add a new spatial material. We'll double click on that. We're going to go to our albedo texture, and then we are going to go ahead and add in our fire texture. Now I know, why would you use a fire texture, right? Well, because we could just go ahead and make it dark. And then we can go into our flags. We can say transparency is on, and you can see now it's transparent smoke look to it. And we can add a, let's see, we can add I'm sorry, not an add, it has to be a mix, doesn't it? So we can go ahead and add some opacity to this. So if we open up our color and drag our opacity down to something like this, and then let's go back to our material, or to our particle system, and we'll go ahead and increase our number of particles. So if we go up here from 8 to something like, 80, There we go. That's much, much more, I guess, realistic, right? And I don't, as much as I like this, I don't think having something like this is very realistic. So we'll increase our sphere radius so you can see some of that fire coming through. And that's really about it, guys. So thank you very much for watching. You know, we covered particle systems. We covered really all of the line items inside of this little area here, you know, all of what these do. We talked about different draw passes, and we talked about how to set up your material to kind of work with particle systems. And we talked about like billboarding and things like that. We also built a small fire, which is always exciting. And really, that's about it. So I want to thank you guys again so much for watching. And, you know, if you like this video, hit the like button. And if you dislike this video, you know, you can hit that dislike button, because the more information I get from you guys about what you guys like, the more of that content I'm going to try to create. So thank you again for watching, and I'll see y'all next time. Thanks.